All right, we'll get started tonight. First, I want to thank everyone here for joining. This is the third of 4 community conversations we're hosting as part of our Bridges of Memory series this summer. And in case you missed the first one with Demetrius talking about growing up the son of a Holocaust survivor, or Kosel talking about the Kamai community in the Twin Cities, they're both archived on the YouTube channel. And maybe George can share a link in the chat there. As I mentioned, this is part of the Center's Bridges of Memory project. And for the last year, we've been working on building and strengthening relationships between communities impacted by genocide with the university and our center. And these conversations have centered on a lot of the topics that we'll talk about tonight: commemoration, education, and resilience. And this idea comes from the realization that the Twin Cities is home to tens of thousands of resettled people, some for decades, like the Armenian community tonight, and others much more recently. But a common thread is that many have been forced to flee because of violence in their home countries. It's our hope that through Bridges of Memory, we can act as better stewards through the university community and our neighbors, and give these communities a platform to share their own stories. And just a few administrative pieces tonight. First, Nicole and Maria are going to be providing an ASL interpretation throughout tonight's event, and we'll be able to answer questions should the need arise in the chat. Second, closed captioning is available. To adjust the size of your captioning, click on the CC and adjust the size captioning in the settings accordingly. And on that note, a computer is probably the best way to view tonight's program and provide the best experience for ASL interpretation and closed captioning if you require either of those. And then finally, George is also going to be in the chat tonight with any questions. And we'll hold off on any questions for Father Tadeos tonight till the end of the presentation. So I want to introduce our guest tonight, Father Tadeos. Sorry. Father Tadeos is sorry, I lost my notes now. Father Tadeos was born in, I'm sorry, Father Tadeos, I like people to say, can you?
You can say Armenia, born in Armenia.
Born in Armenia and graduated from the Gevorkian
Yes.
Theological Seminary with a bachelor's and master's degree in theology, and was ordained in the Holy Priesthood in 2009. In 2011, Father Tadeos was assigned to serve in the Eastern Diocese of the Armenian Church of America. And in 2012, Father Tadeos was assigned as the pastor of St. Sahag Church in St. Paul. In 2016, Father Tadeos graduated from the University of St. Thomas with a master's degree in the field of theology. So, welcome, Father Tadeos.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So let's start off with a question here. I'm curious, can you tell us a little bit about the Armenian community in the Twin Cities?
Sure. We like to think of ourselves, Armenian community, we are a small but mighty community. and that's true for Armenians probably. That's a saying actually coming to us from 5th century. First Armenian historian, when he wrote his first book, Complete History of Armenia, of Armenians, he said, we are small and small nation, but we are mighty nation. There is a lot of works happening in our nation that are worthy for writing them down, and notable works. But Armenian communities, as you said, one of the oldest communities that settled here even before the Armenian Genocide. The first settlers came to Minnesota probably 1890s, 94 and 96. And it's important to know that this was the beginning of massacres in Western Armenia as well by Sultan Abdul Hamid. Before Armenian Genocide, there were massacres happening in different parts of Western Armenia. And the first mass massacre happened in 1894 in a region called Mush, and that's where my father's side is from, and that's when they fled Western Armenia. So many, some people moved to United States at that time, mostly for work and for education, and some of them different reasons, coming to North Dakota for railroad and infrastructure, and some of them ended up in Minneapolis. There was a rock store even that opened at that time that exists until now. But I think more Armenians came to Minnesota after the Armenian Genocide. The first survivor of the Armenian Genocide arrived in Minnesota in 1919. And at that time, there was an article about her in a Minneapolis paper. Star Tribune used to be called Minneapolis paper before it was renamed Star Tribune. There was an article about her because her case and her story was extraordinary. She was enslaved, and she had marks and tattoos, as we call them today, on her face, and it was the custom at the time in Turkey. If young girls and ladies, they were taken, they were usually enslaved, and she was able to escape because her family was here. Brother particularly was here. She was able to make it to Minneapolis and St. Paul. But Armenian community has been here for some time. There were some activities and organizations formed, and in 2001, an Armenian church was established here in St. Paul, and Saint Sahag, as was the church that started here, and it is the only Armenian church in the state of Minnesota, as well as North Dakota, South Dakota, and Iowa. So it's the only Armenian church between Milwaukee and Seattle, and of course it is the center of Armenian community events, gatherings, advocacy, religious life, cultural life. Everything is centered around the Armenian church, being the heart of the Armenian community. On our list that we are able to count, probably we have about somewhere between 270 to 300 families that are connected to the community, both to a spiritual aspect and to cultural, as well as heritage and advocacy work of the church. Most of them from Minnesota, but also from North Dakota, South Dakota, Iowa, and northern parts of Wisconsin, since the closest church is in Milwaukee. So St. Paul becomes Saint Sahag becomes the closest church to those families. But Armenian community is diverse here. Even within Armenian community, we have diversity. We have, of course, many third and fourth generation Armenians whose parents already were grandparents, even they were born and raised here, and parents, and of course they may have born probably in different parts of the country, in Detroit, in Chicago, even in California, or in East Coast and Boston, Rhode Island, and New York. But somehow, because of work and marriage, they moved to Minnesota and made Minnesota their home, and they have been here for decades already. We have Armenian families who moved in the 70s and 80s from Middle East because of unrest in the Middle East, and their generations, their children are here as well. We have some new Armenian families who moved after the collapse of Soviet Union, and even before the collapse of Soviet Union. As some of you may know, during the collapse of Soviet, when it was happening already in 1988 and 89, there were massacres of Armenians in Baku, Azerbaijan, and many of them they left their homes. They were forced to leave their homes, and North Dakota at the time was one of the few states that accepted those Armenian refugees from Baku, Azerbaijan, and many of them came to North Dakota, and later they came down to Minneapolis. It was warmer here, probably that's why. And so we have many families who are originally from Baku, Azerbaijan, and they are more or less, of course, older generation. They're Russian-speaking Armenian, and myself being able to speak Russian, it helps me relate to them as well. And we have newer families who came from Armenia, who migrated from Armenia, and they came either for work assignment, to work for different corporations and companies here, or for University of Minnesota, or for different universities. So it's very diverse community, and as I said, church is the center and one roof that bring all of us together under one roof to be able to celebrate our heritage, to be able to talk about and raise awareness about the issues that we here to celebrate our heritage through the festivals, events, and gatherings, to worship together in our church, of course. And we are an important part in fabric, as we say, of Minnesota community, because Armenians have been contributing to this state, to the greatness of this state for already many generations, and we call ourselves proud Minnesotans as well. And I've been here already. It'll be 8.5 years, and I call this state my home. My family's here, my children, and we made this state and this wonderful and welcoming state our home as well. And we're proud for that and blessed for that.
One thing I remember talking with you in the past is that one common thread amongst all these different waves of Armenians who settled in the Twin Cities here is they've all been impacted by the genocide, either family directly, or it's something that it kind of binds everyone together. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the role of the genocide in the Armenian community a little bit more.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting note that you made, interesting comment. It's hard to find an Armenian or an Armenian family that has no connection to the tragedy of the Armenian genocide. We all have had relatives, in some cases our great-grandparents, in my case, and many others that we may know, or grandparents or great-grandparents who were victims of the Armenian genocide, who were we call them saints because they were martyrs of the Armenian genocide. So it brings all of us together because we have this generational memory. We all are impacted by this memory. We all carry this memory with us, and we all are still fighting. We are still connected with this fight and of recognition of the Armenian genocide, since it hasn't been recognized properly yet. As we say, the wounds are open, are still open because they haven't been healed. The wounds, the healing hasn't happened yet, and somebody may call this generational trauma that we all carry with us, and difficulty. But of course, it is also a responsibility for all of us to raise awareness about something horrible, something that shouldn't happen to any nation, to any ethnic group. And it's also global responsibility for us to raise awareness and to talk about. In the Armenian community, I think generally we have done a good job of raising awareness, along with other communities, along with other partners, being the voice for the voiceless, being the voice for the victims, and talking and keeping this issue as active as possible. Because if when Holocaust was happening, when Hitler was asked, there's this famous quote about Hitler when he was asked, "Aren't you afraid of the judgment by the community of what you're doing?" He said, "Well, who after all remembers the Armenian genocide or massacres of Armenia, annihilation, to be correct, of Armenians?" So we also have responsibility for remembrance, of historical remembrance. That is important. Somebody may say, well, it's been already more than 100 years. It's time to move on for Armenian community. Of course, we are moving on. Of course, we are creating even the first generations of survivors who came to Minnesota and to other parts of these country states. They were able to move on and create family for themselves, being successful. They opened schools, they opened church. That's a sign of moving on. We are moving on. We are not in that. We are not being always in this mentality of being victims. We are victims. We cannot create anything. We are not able to do anything. No, that's not how Armenian community treated themselves. That's not how Armenian community functioned. Armenian community was able to build and to create, to rise from the ashes and create a new life for themselves. So Armenian genocide has a central role for Armenian community. We have responsibilities, we have remembrance, we have responsibility to raise awareness about genocides and massacres, and it's a part of our identity. Many Armenians may not connect to any Armenian function, any Armenian anything Armenian in their lives, no matter whether it is a heritage or culture or religion, faith, or anything, but they feel that Armenian genocide is this one issue that they feel strongly connected, because they have their great grandparents, and they have the stories which are the most powerful impacts, and the stories of their grandparents who went through Armenian genocide, who were killed, and these stories are very much alive stories, and they are being told from one generation to another generation. So Armenian genocide has an important role for the Armenian community to bring all of us together around this issue. And this is one issue that there is no disagreement among the community. Of course, any other issue, if there are three in the room, there are five opinions about any issue if they are Armenians. But this is one issue that we are united, and we are on this journey of recognition and justice for the martyrs of the Armenian genocide.
I'm curious about your own family story. You talked about being the great grandson of a Armenian genocide survivor. What was it like for you with that family story? Could you share a little bit to talk about what it was like growing up?
Sure. It's interesting. I don't remember when this story was told to me, or when I learned about the Armenian genocide. And if you ask any Armenian how they learn about Armenian genocide, I anticipate that probably not many will remember, because it is like something that it comes through memory with you. At some point you hear about it, at some point you're educated about it. You may not remember when it happened, the consequences of that happening, and the environment, how it happened, but it is something that you always remember, you know about it, and you learn more for the rest of your life, and you do the work that is necessary to raise awareness about the Armenian genocide. But of course, as you mentioned earlier, Joe, in the wonderful introduction, that I was born and raised in Armenia, and it is a different, of course, environment. There is no need for raising awareness in Armenia about the Armenian genocide like it is here. Of course, everybody is aware of the Armenian genocide, and every year, April 24th is a remembrance day. That's the day that we commemorate the Armenian genocide, and probably more than 1 million people. And Armenia is a country of 3 million people, so we don't have many people. But about 1 million people visit the Genocide Memorial and Museum in Yerevan, the capital of Armenia. That's the day of reflection, of commemoration, and that's the day of education as well. And since I was little, I remember going to the site to Genocide Memorial, and there were many walking with us, many carrying flowers, and we all bring flowers as a sign of new life, as I mentioned earlier, as a sign of new life, and giving new life to the victims, to the martyrs, and either with my grandparents or with my parents, or later when I was in seminary, we would go to the seminary. We take a bus, and the seminary would provide a bus for all of us and take us there. We would say a prayer there. We would do a requiem service there, and we would come back, of course. But genocide was very much part of our life growing up, especially after the collapse of Soviet Union. I don't remember much since I was 6 or 7 years old when Soviet Union collapsed. But during the Republic of Armenia, when independence was gained, I remember Armenian genocide being very much part of the society. There was always talks and lectures and seminaries, and always education about the Armenian genocide. But personally, both my parents' side, they were survivors of the Armenian genocide. As I said, my father's side, they escaped, and we escaped Western Armenia after the massacres of Abdul Hamid in Mush. About 200,000 people, I believe, at that time were killed in those massacres. So they were mass massacres as well in region of Mush, in Western Armenia. So my father's side, they escaped and they came to Russian Armenia. Of course, Armenia was divided. The reason we call Western Armenia is because we had Eastern Armenia, and Eastern Armenia was part of Russia, and Western Armenia was part of Turkey, and Armenia was divided different times by different countries, Russia or Persia or Iran and Turkey and earlier Arab and Empire and Rome and Byzantine. But on my mother's side, they escaped the Armenian Genocide. Only one person survived. My great grandmother survived, and her entire family was killed. And she was left as an orphan, and she made it to Russian Armenia, and she came to the town called Etchmiadzin. That's the word that you're having a hard time pronouncing. That's the center of the Armenian Church. That's the heart of Armenian Church. That's like our Vatican, because that's where the cathedral is of the Armenian Church. That's where the Catholicos is. That's the seminaries too, the official seminary of the Armenian Church. So I grew up in that town as well. I was born and raised in that town. So she was an orphan, and like many orphans, she came to the church, knocking on the doors, and many orphans ended up on the streets of Etchmiadzin. Etchmiadzin was close to the border as well between Turkey, Western Armenia, and Eastern Armenia. And then later she found another orphan of the Armenian Genocide, and they married, and they created new life and new families and new family and new children. And a new life for themselves. However, she was never able to forget and move forward with carrying the memory of what happened and horror that her family went through. And when she was leaving her home, the soldiers, when they came to force them out of their homes, they told them that don't worry about your belongings. Don't take anything with you. You just have to leave because of the war. World War I is going on at that time, of course. They said, you're close to the border. You have to leave right now. But later we'll come back and we'll come after you and bring you back. So don't worry about taking anything with you. Just lock the door and leave. So they locked the door, and they had the key. She had the key of their house with her. And she always hoped to return one day, even during Soviet Union, even when she was able to create a new family, she was always waiting and hopeful to return to her home, to Western Armenia. And at the end of her life, she would sit every day and look at the door and wait for soldiers to come and take her home. And at the end of the day, she would say, they didn't come today. They didn't come today. They didn't come today. And of course, she passed away. I didn't know her, and I'm told that they buried the key with her. Hopefully, that in spirit she would visit her home and find her home and find some peace and reconciliation in her journey. But that's a story that this is very similar to many stories that Armenians they grew up with. Those of us who are fortunate to hear these stories, those of us whose families were not afraid to tell the stories, or we were comfortable to tell the stories. Not every family was able to do that. There was maybe not the culture of other families, because people go, it was just difficult for them to know what to do. How do we educate? Or some just wanted to forget about what happened and to move on. But I think most of us, we grew up with stories and personal stories and memory that we carry with us as a generational memory. And of course, when you have a story in your family like this, you also have a responsibility for your great-grandparents, for your grandparents, to raise awareness, to bring some kind of justice for them and some kind of peace and reconciliation, because otherwise you feel helpless, and because you don't know how to help, and there's so much distance and time, and that happened, but you still carry that story with you.
I think that's what makes the Treasures of Memory and Hope exhibit that you put together such a powerful experience of taking these seemingly everyday artifacts that people have brought with them and the stories connected with them. I think it's such a powerful tool of educating. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about different ways that the Armenian community has commemorated beyond, maybe a little bit about the exhibit, but also other ways that the community has commemorated the genocide.
Sure. But exhibit is, I'm glad you mentioned Treasures of Memory and Hope exhibit that we were able to put together last year after about a year and a half working on this exhibit. It is inspired by Transfer of Memory exhibit by the Jewish Community Relations Council that they organized. The exhibit is geared towards it is the goal of the exhibit, I should say, is to educate and to inspire people, to educate about the Armenian genocide and to raise awareness about the Armenian genocide, but not through of the horror of the Armenian genocide, but through the stories of survivors, stories of families that came here. They were able to create a new life, they were able to raise family, and to artifacts that they brought with them. So the story, the exhibition is a photography exhibition, photographs of the artifacts and items that survivors they brought with them, whether it is a Bible or ring or a piece of clothing or a book or a portrait or anything that survivors were able to carry, because bringing something with them, anything with them, was a miracle. They were not able to carry anything with them. So the survivors are gone. They are not with us anymore. We don't have many survivors of the Armenian genocide around the world these days. It's been more than 100 years, of course. But we have these artifacts. We have these treasures that families they still keep in their in generations. They still keep, and they are family treasures. So we wanted to tell the stories of the survivors through these treasures, through these items. And it's a public exhibition. It travels to different organizations, public organizations, telling the stories of survivors and hopefully inspiring people, because if these people who went through this horrible tragedy and difficulties, they were able to move on and to create a new life, to be successful again, and anybody who is going through difficulties these days will look at them and, well, if they were able to do it, I can do that as well. I'm able to create a new life for me and for my family, to be able to move on and change things and not to be not to stumble in all of these all the difficulties. But Treasure, Memory, and Hope is one of our latest projects that we did. But of course, the commemoration every year we get together. That's more commemoration is. It's more for Armenian community. Here we get together, we remember, we pray, we reflect, and we have a cross stone outside of our church that we brought from Armenia in 2015, and that's the only cross stone and genocide memorial in the state of Minnesota. We don't have any other genocide memorial, Armenian genocide memorial in the state of Minnesota. So that's the place we get together and we commemorate the Armenian genocide. Of course, there are lectures and there are talks, and there are many other opportunities for Armenian community, not only myself, but for other members of the Armenian community to raise awareness about the Armenian genocide. We have a wonderful scholar in the University of Minnesota Genocide and Holocaust Studies Center, Artyom Tonoyan, who is doing a wonderful job in partnership with Joe and Alejandro and Joachim and many others at the center. And they are of course, every other semester, I believe, we have classes are offered about the Armenian genocide. So education is also an important part of Armenian genocide. But many years ago, member of Armenian community by the name of Asl Interpretation, he was able to establish a chair at the University of Minnesota. It's called Arsham and Charlotte Ohanessian Chair, and every year a lecture is offered, and some other lectures throughout the year as well, when about the topic of the Armenian genocide and beyond the Armenian genocide and human rights and injustice or any other topics that were laid out in the guidelines by Arsham and Arsham Ohanessian mainly. Well, since my arrival here in Minnesota in 2012, my focus has been on public awareness about the Armenian genocide. So we no longer educate ourselves about what happened, but we try to educate others about the Armenian genocide and raise awareness about the issue of genocide and injustice and human rights and massacres. So we were able to do ecumenical services at the Cathedral of St. Paul in St. Paul, when in 2015, for the commemoration, 100th anniversary of the commemoration of the Armenian genocide, we were able to bring all denominations of Catholic, Orthodox, Protestant, all denominations together for an ecumenical service. This service was unique because when we speak of ecumenical gatherings, it is also sometimes it is within the structures of our denominations. When Orthodox, they say ecumenical, it is usually Orthodox with themselves getting together and having an ecumenical service, pan-Orthodox. And Catholics may get together with others, but this was all of us getting together, all denominations getting together, and main denominations in Minnesota: Lutheran, Presbyterian, Episcopalian, Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, and Catholic, and it was presided by the Archbishop of St. Paul of Minneapolis at the time. But beyond that, we were able to raise awareness to different programs, and there are so many programs and projects that we do throughout the year that is hard to name all of them at this time. But with this COVID, of course, coronavirus pandemic, we were not able to continue offering our gatherings and events and educational programs and projects, but we were able to do through a technology that we are blessed to have and we are thankful to have. So Treasures of Memory and Hope was going to be hosted by Alliance Française in Minneapolis and St. Paul. We were not able to do that, unfortunately, but we were able to put together video presentation, visual presentation of the exhibition that was offered to all. So this opens up also opportunities for all to attend. And of course, partnership with the Holocaust and Genocide Studies Center, University of Minnesota, is an important aspect of our work around the issue of the Armenian genocide, around recognition of the Armenian genocide, and raising awareness, because they are a wonderful partner for our community, for our church, and we have been working with a center since probably the beginning of foundation of the center, establishment of the center. Armenian community has always been a loyal partner of the center, and we are proud of that, and we'll continue supporting the center. We'll continue being part of the work that the center is doing, and we are glad for this new program as well, project as well, Bridges of Memory, that brings all the communities together to raise awareness and to share among ourselves our stories. I think they are powerful stories, and they'll help others to learn more about massacres and genocides, and hopefully to prevent others from happening.
Yeah, I should have mentioned that at the beginning, that the relationship between the Armenian community and our center goes back to the founding long before our time, I think. Yeah. So it's great that we can continue the tradition of working together a little bit.
Absolutely.
But I wanted to kind of follow up on something you touched on, that really raising awareness of the genocide has been your mission since coming in 2012. Why do you feel it's so important? Why? I mean, you talked about this as an event that was 100 years ago. Why is it so important that we were raising awareness of the Armenian genocide?
Well, because historical remembrance is important. I think if you don't remember the history of what happened, sometimes history tends to repeat itself. And if you're not equipped with the memory of history, if you're not equipped with knowing what happened, we are not prepared. If, for example, if you look at this pandemic that is happening right now, we are in the middle of this. Where do people look at to learn? How do we learn about pandemics? Well, it happened 100 years ago, pandemic. the one that happened before this was a Spanish influenza pandemic, and that's where people go to now and as a point of reference to learn more about pandemics, because we lost that memory of how to respond to a pandemic. And even on our spiritual aspect, when we are trying to, as a church, to how to respond to this pandemic, we don't have any literature about this. The only letter we have about pandemic is in 1918 by a parish priest in one of the Armenian churches, who sent a letter to the center of the church saying, how do I give communion in the middle of this pandemic? People are asking for communion. How do I do that? And he said, it's also more, how do I make communion, because there is no flour. I cannot make a bread. We don't have flour. It's a plague. It's so difficult. It's interesting. That's the only literature they were able to find when they tried to study and research and how to navigate through this pandemic. So historical memory, I think, for any issue, for anything, is really, really important, because we need to have that reference. We need to be prepared, and if you lose that memory, I think history tends to repeat itself. If you're not ready, for example, if we see trends of leaders going towards direction that is dangerous, we need to be able to recognize that and call on that and say, this path is dangerous because many years ago, this is the path, this is the journey they took, and this is where they ended up. This is what ended up happening. So we need to be able to learn about historical events and learn our lessons from these historical events. And as I mentioned earlier, that important quote by Hitler, that who remembers, it's only 20, 30 years later after the Armenian, after the Armenian Genocide. So if Armenian Genocide was punished at the time, Armenian Genocide was recognized at the time, and perpetrators, they were punished by international community, Holocaust probably might have been avoided, or we wouldn't have the unfortunate events of later times. But of course, there's always every time when a genocide or massacre happens, every time we say never again, but if we say that after every genocide massacre happens. However, it is important to talk about these issues and raise awareness about genocides and holocausts and massacres, because we don't want any other nation, we don't want any other ethnic group, we don't want any other even a minority group, any other people. It doesn't matter the size, how big it is. The millions are not the important point of defining what genocide is. It is the intent that defines the genocide. So every time we see that intent, we need to be able to recognize the intention. We need to be able to recognize. Of course, it may be difficult, but we need to call this is the intention. If intention is to annihilate a race, a group, a heritage and culture, that is a genocide, and should be recognized, and there should be consequences of that happening. So memory is a historical memory, as I said, is very important to be better equipped, to be better prepared as a humanity, as human beings. And this pandemic is teaching us a lesson as well. But I think, as I mentioned earlier, we are talking about justice, talking about injustices, become part of our identity. And when we see it, we want to raise awareness about it. When unfortunate killing of George Floyd happened in Minneapolis, a few weeks later, I visited the site. Not a few weeks later, probably after riots and violence was a little peaceful after all of that. A few days later, I visited the site, and I placed an Armenian cross at the site, and I said a prayer for his soul, because I didn't want, in the midst of all of this, that he is forgotten. A prayer for his soul is forgotten. So I said a prayer for his soul, But when I was going there, I had an interesting feeling. I parked my car a few blocks away. I was not able to get closer than that, and I had a few items for donation as well. So I parked a few blocks away, and I was walking. I saw many people coming to the side, and they were all bringing flowers with them. They were bringing some items with them, and they were reflective, and they were thinking, and some of them praying. And I had the same feeling as I described earlier when I would visit the Genocide Memorial in Armenia, and I paused and I thought about it. And it's just, I have the same feeling. It's like I'm back in Armenia. I'm walking with people. There are millions of people around, not here, but you have the same feeling. You have the same experience, because I think injustice, because I think unnecessary massacre and killings are always, the experience is the same, the feeling is the same, and I think remembrance, recognition, advocacy are important to help and to protect others. I think ourselves and others as well. And that's why it is important for Armenian communities, important for Jewish community, for Ukrainian community, for many other communities to talk about what happened to them, because if you don't, others may forget. Others may forget, and there will be nobody to talk about it. And if you don't talk about it, it'll be forgotten. And if it is forgotten, it may happen again. So we need to be prepared. We need to know, and we need to learn, and we need to respond when time comes, when we see early signs of something so horrible happening, and we need to call and say this is wrong.
I appreciate you sharing that story about visiting the memorial site with George Floyd. I think that's a really powerful experience and connection to a lot of the things that we talk about as part of this project. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about some of the positive inside, those ways that you've been able to increase recognition of the Armenian genocide in your time and over the last 8 years.
Well, of course, there is a lot of, you mentioned positive, right? Positive sides. Of course, people are thankful for learning, and it's interesting. Every time we talk about, every time we have an educational event, we have a reception for the exhibition. We have the exhibition opening at different places. People come and learn, or different gatherings or festival, and people are first they are surprised. How come we didn't hear more about it? How come we didn't know? And they feel somewhat empowered and inspired by the stories, but also they have sense of responsibility that we shouldn't let anything like this happen again. What happened was tragic. What happened was horrible to the people, and nobody should go through this. So if we have more advocates, if we have more people speaking up, if we have more people having understanding of what genocide and Holocaust and massacres are, I think we'll have more partners on our journey, and we'll have more recognition. And of course, today's generation are the ones educating the next generation. And if we have understanding, and if we have recognition, if we have knowledge for justice, we are the ones educating the next generation. I think it's important to talk about all these issues. I think it's important to educate, and I think with positive attitude. Every time we try to do that, as I said, the exhibition is also from the angle of inspiring people by the examples of resilience, by the examples of faith and hope of survivors. And I think that's a positive thing. And when students, they learn about genocide and massacres, and it's always very inspiring when I have a high school student, for example, from, I don't know what academy, what school. She was so inspired by some of the talks or some of the events that we did. She decided to write an essay about the Armenian genocide. And that's not the only time. There's not the many others we receive sometimes in their newsletters, or so it is inspiring for people to learn more and to be inspired and to respond and to acknowledge, and I think it is positive step. Our purpose is not to condemn. Our purpose is to learn, to be educated, to raise awareness, and to understand and to acknowledge, and to prepare all of us for something so horrible that it won't happen in the future to any group. So our journey is positive, and people are joining us on that positive journey as well.
And unfortunately, the converse is true too. I think one of the things that intertwines our center with the Armenian community is this continuation of denialism, the denial of the Armenian genocide. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about having experienced that, or how do you respond to this rhetoric that's still all too common?
Well, when we speak about something positive that happened, I think last year probably many of our listeners now, many of our attendees now, may remember last year both Congress and both House of Representatives and Senate, they recognized the Armenian genocide. In both cases, I think Senate was unanimously, House of Representatives was by majority of the vote, which was something positive. We talk about official recognition on federal level by this country, which hasn't happened officially, either this administration or the previous administration or the one before that, or there were attempts, I think, in the past, and there were comments by presidents. But I think Congress and Senate recognizing that's a powerful step. I think that's a positive step, and that's an important overdue recognition of the Armenian genocide by these important levels of the government of this country. However, it hasn't happened on the federal level by this administration yet. That's something positive that happened. And of course, when something like this happens, more people learn about it, more people talk about it, and more people say, well, why we haven't recognized for so long? Why this is this happening now? And whether it was, some say it was political or not political. Well, it was because of this politics that it hasn't been recognized until now, and that's part of it. You know, Armenian genocide unfortunately became this sometimes political issue too, that some people may use, some parts of some parties or lobbyists, and it's sad for us to see that, because for us Armenian genocide is not about politics. It has nothing to do with politics, but it is about human lives. It is about human rights issue than about politics. And of course, we have these political games going on when it comes to recognition by Turkey, recognition by some other states, and by United States as well. And we had that in our own state when our own representative, Ilhan Omar, 5th District of Minneapolis, she instead of voting in party lines with her party, which voted unanimously for recognition of the Armenian genocide, she was the only one that chose to vote present, unfortunately, for the Armenian genocide. Well, later she acknowledged that it was probably a mistake through the inner circles that we learned. But unfortunately, she already voted, and she tried to justify something that is not justifiable. And that it was pure politics too when she did that. The important thing to notice here is when people don't recognize, or when people don't vote, or it is not always can be defined as denial. They may need some more education. They may need some more awareness about this. They may be in different place at a time, and sometimes they are forced to make these decisions. But of course, being on the side of truth is always beneficial. Being on the side of truth is always important for anybody, especially when it comes to public officials. On a university level, on educational level, of course, the center experienced that denial firsthand when a center was involved in a legal fight with a Turkish group here in Minneapolis, I believe, and of course the center was able to win that case against this group. This happened probably before you and me, Joe. Probably I know about this by stories, and of course we have personally. I met a Turkish scholar here at the University of St. Thomas when I was studying. Wonderful person. He was a theologian. He was teaching at the university. He came from Turkey, and he was raised with the Turkish official idea that genocide didn't happen. It was part of World War I, and it was part of the war. Unfortunate things happened during war, but there was never a genocide. There was never intent. And we talked civil, and we had lunch together. We talked about it. He has his points. He has his arguments that, of course, are fed by. But the good thing about him was he said, I'm willing to be educated about this. If you bring me the literature, I'm willing to read. I'm willing to learn more about it. I appreciated that. I think the temptation for us, for the victims and for survivors and for generations, is that when we see denial, we respond with such force and we respond powerful to something like that, because it is emotional for us when somebody denies what happens, and you know the stories, you know what happened. It's something denied, somebody denies that. But I think we have to keep in mind that in some cases it might be a need for more education. People may not be there. People may grow up with different ideas, and as I said, official government system dogmas or education about the Armenian genocide. So we need to be patient. We need to educate people when needed. We need to be ready ourselves. We need to be prepared ourselves. And when we see something like that, at least in our community, and my message to our people is to be patient. Of course, they're not always patient when it comes to denial, and of course, and especially older generation, the second generation, when their parents they told them the stories. But I think we need to respond with force when it is necessary, when there is plain denial of the Armenian genocide. If there is a need for education, we'll try to educate and provide that opportunity for these people to learn more about the Armenian genocide.
I think what always impresses me after talking to you is just your continual optimism in this idea that people who don't know anything, it's an opportunity for education. I think that is just it's an incredible attitude to have, especially in the face of some strong rhetoric. I think that's fantastic.
Yeah.
And I think what I want to ask you is maybe a difficult question here, but what's something that you want everyone to take away understanding about the Armenian genocide? If you could boil it down, what do you want people to understand and remember?
Well, I think it is difficult, and meantime it is a very simple question. There is a difficult answer for that, and there is a simple answer for that. I think as we mentioned earlier, remembrance, responsibility, and education, and I think are important aspects of the Armenian genocide. We need to remember. We need to be prepared. We need to learn the history, what happened to the Armenians, because if you don't remember, it may happen again to any other people, any other group. So we need to be, all of us, we need to be disciples. So if you allow me to use religious language, we need to be disciples and advocates of human rights and any injustice that we see happening to any ethnic group. But I also want people to know the stories of survivors, how they were able to be persistent when they were able to see the light at the end of the tunnel. Imagine a woman walking in a desert. She has nothing with her. Her family was killed. She has kids with her, children with her. Some of her children were killed. She has only one or two probably. She's still walking in that desert. There is hope that she has. There is that hope that she has that things are going to get better. Things are going to change. This is going to change. It's not always going to be difficult. Otherwise, she would just give up and just and let them kill her and her children and just give up because it's too hard. And very often it is easy for some people to give up in the midst of difficulties and challenges and say, well, I'm giving up, and we see that unfortunately happening way too often. But I think when we see these people and we see the hope they had, they saw the light for new life. They saw something better, something good, and that's what there was. That was that hope that make them walk in that desert, in that Syrian desert. If you we talked about why it's important. A few years ago, there were many, until now, there were many Syrian refugees in a desert called El Deir Zor, in the Syrian desert. Well, 100 years ago, Armenians were in the same desert. And if you compare the images of today and images of the Armenian genocide, they are eerily similar. They were very similar. The only difference is that the clothing, of course, is different. But is the black and white back then, and today is colorful pictures, and there is video as well. But the faces of people are the same. The experience is the same, because genocide is they were trying to escape ISIS. They were trying to escape the extremists. They were trying to survive, and that's the attitude that Armenians had as well. So if we may think 100 years ago, Armenians in desert, that desert is still there. People are still in that desert. There's still refugees in that desert. So things like these are not not in history. Armenian genocide, or be heard about. When I was little, when I was reading, not little, I mean when I was started reading books about Armenian genocide, when I read about hangings and beheadings, Armenian priests being hanged in the square, Armenian writers and politicians, I thought, well, how could they allow this happening? And we saw that happening a few years ago when ISIS took over a large part of Middle East, and same things were happening there. And it's like we have the same stories happening again. Women ladies being enslaved and being marked on their faces, and and people being hanged and even being beheaded. These stories happen again in our recent times even. So remembrance is important, responsibility, but also having understanding that what these survivors went through was horrible, and yet they have hope. And light for a better future. And that's what helped them walking in that desert. That's what helped them come to United States, go to Europe and different parts, go to Armenia and Russia and any other country that you may think of on this earth. There are Armenians and many of them very successful. I have to say, because they were able to create new life for themselves and for their families.
So I want to make sure that we leave a little time for questions at the end here. So while people are formulating their questions, I want to ask you, Father Tadeos, is there anything that I didn't ask you that you want to share, or things you want to mention? It's maybe the most difficult question, the open-ended one. But if there's anything that we left out,
well, I think I would like to say how appreciative and grateful we are for this opportunity and for this partnership and cooperation with the center, and of course for this new project that we all are trying to make it successful bridges of memory. I remember when we were talking about this project and program, Bridges of Memory, it was the first event was actually a launching event, both for the project was hosting the Treasure of Memory and Hope exhibit at the University of Minnesota. And we were talking about this and how to do events, and we had a few gatherings. I remember the gathering with the Ukrainian community, community leaders, bringing all of us together to share our experiences, to share our practices, our events, and our strategy, and what do we do. And after all of these, the coronavirus pandemic happened, and some of our projects probably were postponed. But I think this is also a good opportunity to think of these alternative ways of coming together, for maybe a podcast or video programs, or to be able to include more people from different parts of the state, of the country, and also of the world. People may come from different parts of the world to be able to participate in these powerful discussions and conversations and education. So I think there is a saying in Armenian: with every evil comes something good. Of course, pandemic is so horrible and took many people's lives, but it forces us also to think about of these other ways that we can raise awareness, other ways that we can do programs, and not necessarily involving a certain place, certain classroom of people coming and traveling, which may create some difficulties these days, especially when it is so difficult for people to make that time for extra education, for extra event. So I think these opportunities are wonderful, and we are so grateful to the center and to you, Joe and Alejandro, and for being such wonderful partners and working together in raising awareness. So we are grateful for the center, to the center, that there is such a center, and we can partner with this center. So we are thankful.
No, and I think we're incredibly grateful for your time tonight, and so appreciative of all that you've done to help support our programs and raising awareness of the Armenian genocide. And as you mentioned, these are sort of uncertain times, and we're using new ways to share information and share these events. And it's a good reminder that this will be on YouTube, that you can come back and look at this later on if you want to refresh yourself or share our conversation tonight and the other ones from this series. But with that, I think I'll turn it over to George to see if there's any questions. We actually have the chat and the Q&A open this time. It looks like accidentally. So George, it looks like you have double duty. But I'll turn it over to George.
All right, thank you so much. All right, thank you so much. Apologize for the technology issues. It's been so great, Father Tadeos, to hear you speak this evening. And we do have a few questions, and so I'd encourage panelists to add questions to the chat or the Q&A. And maybe to start with, one attendee asks, writing, I agree that Father Tadeos' story of visiting the George Floyd Memorial was incredibly powerful and moving. And I'm curious whether the Armenian community has ever or plans to engage in external advocacy on behalf of other communities fighting for historical justice and recognition, like the Black community in the United States, Ukrainians, or others.
Oops, I forgot to turn on my. Thank you for the question. As I mentioned earlier, our focus since 2012 has been raising awareness of genocide and massacres, injustice outside of the walls of Armenian community and Armenian Church, because that's the place that we get together very, very often. And tendency for our ethnic groups very often is to close down within our walls and to talk about things that happen to us, and to educate ourselves about what happened, something that is not necessary, because we already what happened. But that's the reason that we organize all these events and projects, the ecumenical service that we did, the exhibition that we do, an involvement in different, myself as a religious leader of the community, and in general as a representative, being the only Armenian priest, being the leader of the community in ways that sometimes I choose, sometimes I may not choose, but I'm placed in that role, representing the Armenian community. So visiting the site was important, and as a clergy, and I think our community needed that. Our community wanted to be part of this historical event in a way that represents our community, represents the prayer, and who we are, and me as myself as the religious leader of the community. But with Ukrainian community and other communities, as I said, we already had one project and program as provided a platform by the center when we came together with Ukrainian community leaders, and we talked about their experience. We shared our experience. Of course, we had a journey that has been probably 100 years of advocacy work. For them, it is relatively new, so we gladly shared that experience and expressed our willingness to help and to support them when needed. On different levels, personal levels of our community, many of our community members and myself, when we have the opportunity, we are involved in different community activist work with Black community, with other communities. Every year, for example, we have an event called Three Voices, Three Communities, One Voice event with the Coptic community and with the Jewish community. And our plans are to include also Native American community for this event. When three biblical communities that experienced massacre and genocide, and for the case of Coptic community, they experienced that until this day, massacres and happening in Egypt these days, when churches are burned, when priests are killed, when people are killed, and it's horrible. So they are still experiencing. They're in the middle of all of that, and for them it is not even very. Sometimes they don't even feel safe to come out and talk about this, because if it is known, if by the Egyptian government or some extremist group, another massacre may happen. And for them, it is a little bit of a balance and a little bit of a struggle. So they are still in the midst of. And for us, for Armenian community, just a few weeks ago in Lebanon, in Beirut, there was this large protests against Armenians, and they were chanting "Kill" by Turkish diaspora members in Beirut. And they were chanting "Kill Armenians, kill those Armenians," and all kinds of names. There was just one incident when Armenian TV reporter, he shared the personal threats that he received on TV, live TV, and they created these large demonstrations against Armenians. Just last week, President Erdogan of Turkey created special department as part of a government for denial of the Armenian genocide. So there is also now it's part of system. So we are still in that struggle. We are still fighting for recognition. There is still systematic denial of the Armenian genocide, but we are also part of larger. As I said, it's a global responsibility for us. We are a larger part of larger community, and when we see injustice happening, when there is a need for us to raise our voices, we are always there. Armenian community is always there, whether by prayer or advocacy work or raising our voices or being part of a community. So Armenian community has been always supportive to other communities in their journey.
Great. Thank you so much, Father Tadeos. We have two more questions that are related, and so I'll read them both at the same time here. So one says, first expressing thanks, and then asks, can you talk about how the younger generations of Armenian Americans relate to the genocide? And then a slightly related question, the person asks, I was intrigued by your comments about young people relating to the Armenian identity through the genocide, and then asks a follow-up, do you see that as problematic in any way?
Could you repeat that question, George? I didn't understand the last part.
No, the first one is just asking how Armenian Americans, younger generations of Armenian Americans, relate to the genocide. And then the second question, it's asking, it's building on your comment that young people relate to Armenian identity through an understanding of the genocide. And asking if you find that problematic in any way.
Yes, many for many young Armenians, the education about the Armenian genocide comes through the family and through family stories. For many, it is generational memory they have. It is a struggle that they have. For many, they have a feeling of being helpless. Some find it difficult and challenging to have this huge responsibility. I don't want to call it a burden, but some may call that, some may view that because now they have this story of the Armenian genocide. For some, they don't know what to do. For many of them, it is clear they have to raise awareness. They have to talk about it. It is very much part of their identity. It is very much part of their heritage, and Armenian genocide being an important aspect. Since, as I mentioned earlier, since there is still work to do, since there is still denial of the Armenian genocide, and that denial, very often they think if unfortunately, they are not being smart deniers. If they continue denying, it is going to create the counter effect. More Armenians, more people are going to talk about it. People are going to continue talking about it. There are going to be more. There is going to be more awareness about the Armenian genocide. So denial enforces sometimes that memory as well, because there is still denial, so there is still work to do. And for many Armenians, that's the path. For many young Armenians, that's the path. For some of them, they don't know what to do with this. They are understandably confused. They are understandably they don't have clear path. They have the story, they can talk about it, but advocacy work may not be the path they choose. But I think the story lives with them. At some point, it may come out in different ways. For everybody experiences differently. And young generation, they have their own life, and they have their own world, and it's very different from the world that survivors lived or their children. And it is very different. It's hard for them, hard for their parents sometimes to get them focused on certain topic or another. But for parents, I think it is important that education is very important, raising them with identity, raising them with understanding of what happened to their grandparents is very, very important. Now, also there, as I mentioned, Armenian community is very diverse. There are few generations of already American-born Armenians. For them, Armenian genocide is very much still part of their identity, because they are a consequence of the Armenian diaspora is a result of the Armenian genocide. If there was no Armenian genocide, well, Armenians wouldn't be around the world. Well, we would be in our homeland. We would continue living a life in our homeland. But because they were forced to leave, they ended up in different parts of the world. There is new wave of Armenians. We have different understanding of the Armenian genocide. We have coming from different education, coming from our parents, they were raised in Soviet Union. They were not allowed to talk about the Armenian genocide. And this new generation, they were allowed to talk about Armenian genocide, and they want recognition too. They're on this journey of advocacy. So for each, I think this journey is very personal. Generally, everybody's connected. For all of them, the issue of the Armenian genocide is very much part of the identity, but it may be reflected, it may be introduced in different ways to the public when opportunity arises for them to talk about the Armenian genocide.
Thank you so much. Speaking of the Armenian diaspora, we have a couple of questions. One asks if you could speak about the relationship between Armenians in Armenia and the Armenian diaspora. And, are there coordinated efforts, especially around genocide recognition, between different, groups within the Armenian diaspora, and perhaps back to Armenians in Armenia?
Yes, especially after the collapse of Soviet Union, the relationship between Armenian diaspora and Armenia today grew stronger because Armenians were allowed to travel back to Armenia, and many Armenians chose to do that, especially during the war with Azerbaijan for Nagorno-Karabakh, for the independence and liberation of Nagorno-Karabakh. Many Armenians chose to travel back and to join the Armenian army and to defend their homeland. And many Armenians, they lived with that dream of having a homeland. But nowadays, I think the partnership between Armenian diaspora and Armenia is more in manner and way of supporting Armenia, and also in a way of visiting Armenia as the homeland that we have. Many diasporan Armenians, of course, are from Western Armenia, and that is today's Turkey. And for them, if they visit today's Turkey, there is nothing left there. There is no relatives, there is no towns, the names of the towns are changed, everything is gone because everything was erased, the heritage erased, the churches and monasteries. And when we talk about Armenian genocide and any genocide, it is important to note that genocide is not only annihilation of human lives, but also it is the destruction of culture and heritage that happens in parallels with destruction of human lives. So all of that is erased. So if they go back, they won't find anything relatable. But the only thing they found today, we find today in diaspora, is the homeland, the small Armenia that we have. It was part of Russian Armenia, but it's still Armenia. So that's the homeland that we have today. So many of us, many diaspora Armenians, we visit for inspiration, for connection with our heritage, with our homeland. There are many organizations that support diaspora organizations that support Armenia. Our churches, our dioceses, they have organizations, or AGBU, Armenian General Benevolent Union, that is founded way before the Republic of Armenia, has been supportive of Armenia, schools and programs and many other projects that they do in Armenia. The relationship is very strong between diaspora in Armenia and Armenia today. However, there are two different entities. Armenian diaspora it has its own organizations, has its own political parties, and mindset, and way of life and culture, and sometimes we want that replicating in Armenia as well. And a few years ago, in 2018, we had a revolution in Armenia, and young people in Armenia, they went on the streets and they protested the government, and they had a bloodless revolution in Armenia. And while many countries are going back to more national movements, Armenia had another direction. They moved towards democratic government, more democratic government. No buildings were burned. Nothing was. Nobody was injured. But we had a peaceful revolution in Armenia. Something that Diaspora was preaching for a long time. Something that Diaspora was very much in favor of a long time. And the revolution even created even more opportunities for diaspora in Armenia to partner with the administration, with the current government of Armenia today. So I think after the revolution, this connection with Armenia grew even stronger. When it comes to genocide, Armenia has its own legal entities that they continue the fight for recognition, especially on European levels, on European courts, officially representing the Republic of Armenia. But they are very much in partnership with Armenian organizations such as ANCA and Armenian Assembly. Those are organizations that do main advocacy work on behalf of diaspora Armenians. And many of us, we are part of those organizations, and many of us, when needed, we partner with them on our state level. So there is a system, there is a structure that Armenians developed for probably as a result of the work that has been going on in this country for already many decades, and that work was especially empowered by the Republic of Armenia, by a new government, especially after the revolution of Armenia.
Thank you so much, Father Tadeos. I think, looking at the clock, I think we're maybe time for one more question, and perhaps this is a good question to end on. The attendee asks if you could just recommend some books for people that would be interested in reading more about Armenia and the Armenian genocide.
Sure. I think there are many books to read. There are volumes by Richard Hovhannisyan about the Armenian genocide, by a Turkish scholar, Taner Akçam. He published many books about. He's Turkish, not Armenian, but today probably one of the well-known scholars of the Armenian genocide, and he's one of the few that is able to read Ottoman Turkish, the language that was changed after the Armenian genocide, language that was changed to Latin writing after World War I. So study of the Armenian genocide makes it a little difficult. He had access to Ottoman archives, so his work is important. Taner Akçam, I think his work, and his teacher Sahag Armenian, he did a wonderful work and study. He passed away, I believe, last year. So his work is really important, so you can follow. But also, A Black Dog of Faith is an important book. I think you can read, by a Pulitzer Prize winner who was the presenter at the Hovhannisyan lecture a few years ago. And I think Golgotha, Armenian Golgotha, is an also important book to read about the Armenian genocide. But also I recommend the movie Promise, The Promise, that was done a few years ago. If you like in the form of a video and movie, I think The Promise was a good movie, especially for public viewing. I think it was done very wonderfully, and some well-known actors and actresses are part of that movie. So I think Peter Balakian, thank you, Alejandro. Peter Balakian's, I forgot to mention his name, Peter Balakian's Black Dog of Faith is also a good book. His personal journey of understanding the Armenian genocide. I think there are many books by many Armenians. They wrote documented their family stories. So I think, and recently, just newest, I think, movie is What Will Become of Us. That is on PBS. that you can watch, especially after Diaspora in Armenia and the work that Diaspora in Armenia has been doing to raise awareness about the Armenian genocide. In our state in Minnesota, we had a WTTP. I think they had a program that hosted some of the Armenian community members, and they did a wonderful program about the Armenian genocide and Armenian community in Minnesota. So I think if you can find that on YouTube as well.
Thank you. I'll also say that the Ohanesian lectures that the center co-sponsors, and I know the St. Sahag and Armenian community supports, are all archived on our YouTube channel, and George sent out a link to that. You can find those there.
At Center and church as well, we have a great library and resource. I think the center, especially some of the studies and research, if you would like to study more, I think they offer wonderful library, and we do have a library at our church as well. So if anybody's interested, they're more than welcome.
Yeah, and I think with that, we'll wrap it up for tonight. I just want to thank Father Tadeos so much for this fantastic conversation. I always learn so much talking to you, Father Tadeos. It's wonderful, and I always, even when we're talking about genocide, I feel the sense of hope, and I think that's really, something really powerful and a testament to your compassion.
Thank you, Joe. I appreciate that, and I'm glad you feel that way. It's inspiring for me to hear that.
And I want to thank our interpreters, Maria and Nicole, for all their work tonight. They've been fantastic. And thank you all of you for joining us tonight. Again, we'll be hosting our fourth and final conversation tomorrow night with Luda and Stefan from the Ukrainian American Community Center. That's again at 7 o'clock over Zoom. And we'll be archiving this conversation on YouTube. That'll be up within the next day or two. So with that, I will say good night and hopefully I'll see you all tomorrow. Thank you so much.
Good night. Thank you.